You're listening to Queer Skies, a podcast exploring queerness, astrology, and the intersection of both. In this episode, we are joined by Michael Morris of Co Witchcraft Offerings, and we discuss the complexity of astrology and spiritual healing, connection within the astrological community, and we expand on the idea of cross-pollination, a concept Kelly Surtees spoke on in her keynote for NORWAC 2019. And we incorporate feminist and queer theory into the practice of astrology through cross-pollination. So sit back and relax because we've got queer skies ahead.
Welcome to Queer Skies, a podcast with myself, Drew Levanti, and co-host Daniel Bernal. We're very happy today to be joined by Michael J. Morris of Co Witchcraft Offerings, who's going to talk to us about their practice as an astrologer and as a human being. So, Michael, would you care to introduce yourself?
Sure. As you said, my name is Michael J. Morris. My pronouns are they, them, their. And I am a witch, an astrologer, an artist, a writer, a facilitator, an educator. I've been a yoga teacher for a long time. As you said, I have a consultation practice called Co Witchcraft Offerings, in which I center astrology and actually tarot as well within different ritual, meditation, and healing practices that I really think help support people in making meaning of their lives, in their personal healing, and all towards something like collective liberation. I also have a PhD in dance studies. I'm a professor at Denison University, where I teach in the departments of dance, the queer studies program, the women's and gender studies program, and the environmental studies program. And I'm in Columbus, Ohio.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background in astrology, like who you've learned from and what kinds of techniques you use?
Oh, sure. Most of my training, most of my study has been focused on Hellenistic astrology the last few years. Although when I think back to some of the earliest books I got on astrology, some of the first people whose careers or work I started following, it was people who were working more in a modern psychological vein of astrology. I think one of my first readings was with Katie Sweetman of Empowering Astrology. And so from the beginning, there was definitely a sense that astrology could be a way for us to live life more meaningfully. But the more I started reading charts, when I started actually practicing and studying, I just felt like I needed more of a foundation in some clearer techniques. Honestly, I originally read in Placidus house system. I was working with modern rulerships, and I was working with the what people call the natural house system or the 12-letter alphabet. And I just felt like there was just so much muddiness and confusion in the delineations that I was making, that the first few times I heard someone talk through a chart using Hellenistic techniques, it really felt like I was hearing a kind of clarity that I wanted in my own practice. So I started studying with Chris Brennan in his Hellenistic astrology course. I also did a lot of online courses and workshops and webinars with Dimitra George and Chani Nicholas and Austin Kopic and Cassandra Tyndall. And then this year I did mentorship with Kelly Surtees as well. And now I would say that most of my practice when I'm reading charts, whether for myself or for clients, it's grounded in the Hellenistic practices and the Hellenistic techniques, but I'm also coming to this from a whole career centered on the body. As a dancer, as a choreographer, as a scholar of dance and performance, as a yoga teacher and yoga practitioner, as a Reiki healer, the body has always been at the center of everything I've done. And so even though I'm coming from these Hellenistic techniques, in the application of them, I'm really concerned with how do we integrate what we learn from the cosmos, from the sky, from these ancient traditions, how do we bring that back into our felt experience of a body? And that's, I think, the direction that I see my practice developing in the most in the days ahead.
Wonderful. So if you were to give like an elevator pitch about your practice to somebody who is not who's not well versed in astrology, and you're trying to communicate what you do to them in an accessible way, what would you say?
That's a good question. That's something that I should have at my fingertips. I would say that I am using ancient techniques for looking at the sky and making meaning of the planets alongside the stars in relationship to different portions of the sky, as a way of understanding our lives here on Earth, that it's always a kind of relationship of building meaning from this relationship to the cosmos, to the sky, but always in relation to where we are. And so in my practice, I mostly work with natal astrology, reading people's birth charts, which is like a snapshot of the sky at the moment that you're born. And part of what astrology understands is that if we examine the conditions at the beginning of something, we can understand something about how that event or process will unfold. And so by studying the placements of the planets and the signs in relation to one another, and in what we call the houses, which are just different areas of life, we can begin to shift our awareness, shift our focus, shift our consciousness into understanding more about ourselves, more about our place in the world, always in relation to this ancient tradition. And for me, that's specifically focused on what I've come to think of as healing, as processes of healing, not so much necessarily in a healing from disease or illness or physical ailment, but the underlying personal, emotional, psychological, social wounds that we all carry, the ways in which power acts on and through our lives, and how do we find our place in relation to layer upon layer upon layer of systems of oppression that we're living through in this 21st century moment. And so even though I'm working from these Hellenistic traditions that tend to be more event focused, more focused on describing or predicting the external conditions surrounding a life, in my practice with people in a consulting room, it's really about how do we feel our way through it? What does it feel like to live our lives through these systems and in these relationships? And how do we make sense of that, particularly at a moment like now that's just so conditioned by political despair and loneliness and isolation, and all the ways in which we're facing crisis in our lives and in our world. And I think astrology is one of the tools that we can use to make meaning of those things.
Something that you said really resonated with me about the way that you are focusing on intentional embodiment and how we're embodying the cosmos and maybe even some of those events that are happening to us, filtering that before we kind of ground it in ourselves and in our body. And I think that resonated because there's a lot of folks who I feel like aren't always aware of how we do always embody things that happen to us, whether that's an intentional process or not. And if it's not intentional, that I think really speaks to a lot of those wounds that you talked about. And they're not physical, but they end up becoming physical, and we end up embodying those in ourselves. And I think a lot of people who are understanding astrology from that perspective, or understanding spiritual healing, and that process that you talk about, are really addressing people's ability to raise that awareness and that filter. And I think that's one of the things that I'm excited to maybe dive deeper into, in terms of how that might show up in your practice and how you blend that with, so these things happen to you, or so your chart says this. What are the ways that you can empower your clients to really process that in a way that they might not otherwise if they weren't approaching it from that lens?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I think most often it takes the form of facing into feeling. You said that even if they don't start physically, a lot of these things become physical. And I would say that even our emotional states, our even the consciousness itself, for me, is deeply embodied, and that's something that we learn from the Tantra tradition, from the yoga tradition, with its roots in India. This idea that the body is a site of so much of what it means to not only be a person, but to be part of something bigger than ourselves, and that the body is a way to feel into our own sense of place, our own sense of belonging, and how we are a part of these bigger systems. And so in astrology, if I read something like, oh, well, you have a difficult placement in the 8th house, for example, and then we end up in a conversation about in what ways has death or mortality played a role in your life so far, that brings up not only history and not only memory, but feeling and stories that people have told themselves or believed about themselves. And then we together get to face into that experience rather than looking away, rather than repressing or avoiding or just trying to get back to work and live life towards some idea of a good life. What happens if we actually take the time to be with whatever feelings are coming up, whether that's about death or love or parents and family or finding a career that's meaningful. There's all sorts of felt states that are accompanying each of those topics. And I think in my practice, I'm really trying to emphasize that whatever information we're getting cerebrally or cognitively from the chart, from the sky, there's a feeling state that describes where it lands. How do you live with that information? How do you live with that delineation? How do you live with what's described in your chart in this way? And trying to give people resources to stay with those feelings, because I think that's where healing can begin to happen.
Mm-hmm. I think our society really emphasizes the idea that we are not physically connected, that our skin is this barrier that is not permeable in terms of like our experience in the world. And whether that's like a materialistic, capitalist reinforced idea or not, I think one of the results or one of the impacts that I see is people, when they realize that we are not just our physical bodies, or that we are not immune physically from the effects of the mental state or consciousness, that becomes a gateway to understanding why spiritual practices are so critical, and why awareness might be something that is necessary for that type of healing or to prevent further issues. It's about one's relationship to the cosmos rather than their relationship to specific events that happen to them in their lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you were saying that, it made me of whether this is an effect of a kind of generalized materialism or capitalist system, or just like centuries of colonization that's convinced us to view ourselves and one another in particular ways. And I'm teaching a course right now at the university called Eco-Sexuality and the Arts. Mm-hmm. We're spending a lot of time with eco-feminist literature, queer eco-feminist philosophy, eco-womanism, queer ecological studies. And something that comes up across all of this literature is the ways in which hierarchical dualisms are mutually constituting, such that that the idea that not only is there this false binary between female and male, but these terms are always put in a hierarchy, such that male is always going to be higher or more important or more centralized than female. And we can see how this dualism plays itself out in terms of straight and not straight, or straight and queer, or white and non-white, or the human and the more than human. We also see it mapped onto the body, such that there is a pervasive disdain for our bodies, for which we see in things like a generalized erotophobia, this like fear of the erotic, this even though we live in a hyper-sexualized culture, there is a resistance or a discomfort around even acknowledging the vast array of our own sexual desires or sexual pleasures, the ways that we relate to our own bodies and one another. And so I think that in order to do any sort of meaningful healing, I mean, this is my bias, but in order to do any sort of meaningful healing, we have to be in some sort of process of repair in relationship to our own bodies and the bodies of others that we're living through centuries of Cartesian dualism that would say that the body and the mind are separate. I don't think that's true, but even the language is structured in such a way to separate us from our bodies. Even saying that our bodies, as if the body is an object or a possession or a commodity, is already problematic. And so I think that part of the work that I'm doing in and through astrology, but really through all of my practices, are trying to bring attention and consciousness to that separation, that disconnection, and beginning a process of connecting back something that didn't need to be disconnected. And I think that we as queer folk experience that pretty acutely as well. When you grow up in a society, in a civilization that at best makes your experience of your own body in terms of desire and pleasure, at best makes it unspeakable, at worst makes it a site of shame or ridicule or harassment or violence, then it's so common for queer folk to have a really challenging relationship to our own bodies, to celebrating our bodies, to loving our bodies, to being vulnerable with other bodies. And so I think as astrologers, but also as queer astrologers or queer people practicing astrology, however we want to parse that, I think that being able to think critically and feel deeply into our own bodies and support other people in that state of feeling just feels so necessary.
Definitely. While you were talking, I was thinking about just your background as somebody in academic life and also as an astrologer, and it made me think about something you said about your experience with Kelly Surtees and how she says that cross-pollination is very important. It's important what you know outside of astrology and how you bring that into your astrology. And as you were talking about language and how dualism is baked in, I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit more on how feminist theory, how queer theory, how these different theoretical backgrounds you have come into your practice, or if you could also maybe reflect on representation in general. As a dancer, as somebody who has a sophisticated language around culture, how do you represent feeling to a client in a similar way that you might represent in the form of dance, or just trying to get into how you cross-pollinate as a multi-practitioner of different things.
Yeah, that's a great direction to move in. And there's a lot, and even there's like 7 different directions.
I know.
But yeah, let's start with that thing that Kelly Surtees said. I think that it was in her NORWAC keynote last year on cross-pollination. She said, the more you know about topics outside of astrology, the better, the more complete, and the more holistic your astrology can be. And I believe that so strongly, because part of what we're doing in any approach to astrology, whether you're working from the Hellenistic practices, the Renaissance traditional practices, the more modern psychological, the evolutionary, whatever, we are all engaging with symbols and archetypes, and in some way or process, we are translating or interpreting or delineating those things into language, into words that we flesh out into sentences, into more complex ideas that then we share with other people and ourselves. And I think we have a real responsibility to think about what are the materials that we're bringing into that process of delineation and interpretation? How are we expounding on these archetypes and symbols? So when we say something like Venus signifies love, well, what do we mean by love? What's the politics that we bring to love? I think about Bell Hooks, Black feminist philosopher. She wrote a whole book called All About Love, and she offers a working definition of love, which is something along the lines of actively contributing to the flourishing and well-being of oneself and another. She says that love is not a feeling, it's a verb, it's an action, it's something that you do. And if we delineate Venus with that in mind, rather than love being that good feeling or rush of hormones that you experience, that's maybe more like attraction or desire, that's a very different delineation to how we understand these concepts that are not neutral. And I think that's maybe gets into your point about how does something like feminist theory or feminist politics or philosophy come into the astrology, is if we start to recognize that all of these concepts that make up our tools in astrology, delineating the planets, the signs, the houses, none of these are culturally or socially or politically neutral. And if we understood that, if we understand that, then what responsibility do we have to cross-pollinate, using Kelly's language, with bodies of thought or writing or thinking that is specifically focused on social justice, collective liberation, the mattering of Black and brown lives, the ongoing pursuit of justice for women and femmes in this world. And like, after centuries of not believing women, of burning women at the stake, and like, we're still in this moment where we actively do not believe women in a society. So then how does that become part of what we're listening to or tuning into as we start to practice our astrology? Who are we reading? Who are we listening to? Whose voices are we paying attention to? How are they shaping the ways in which we're making meaning with this ancient system? I think there's like countless examples in the chart that we could talk through in terms of planets and signs and houses and what that comes up, how those kinds of questions come up. One that comes to mind that is like a starting point is we could talk about the fifth house and what gets traditionally associated with the fifth house. In terms of children, in terms of sex, erotic connection, creative expression. What do any of these things mean in 2019 from something like a queer politics? So then how do we think about the ways in which sex or erotic connection is signified in the fifth house in terms of what gets to count as desire and pleasure? What counts as sex? Who gets to have access to sexual fulfillment or experiencing play and pleasure as part of our lives? Does that shape how we give delineations to our clients? Something I think about constantly in terms of the fifth house is this very traditional association with children. And in 2019, we're living into the sixth great extinction. We are watching the climate collapse at a scale that we've never seen before. And a primary driving factor for all climate collapse, for all climate change, is population growth, which is, of course, distributed differently in terms of the global north, the global south, developed countries, and so on. But with every new person brought into the world, and population has been rising exponentially over the last century, that's another carbon footprint. That's a whole nother contributing factor to all of these other elements and ways that climate change is being escalated. So then how do we talk about children with clients if we know that population growth is actually an ecological crisis? Do we look at if someone has, like, I don't know, Jupiter and Sagittarius in the fifth house, do we look at them and say, you will be very fertile and you will have a large family. Like, don't we have some sort of ethical or political responsibility to come up with another form of delineation that accounts for those significations, but also takes them into the context, the political context that we're living through, the political, social, ecological, ethical context that we're living in. So I've been talking for a while. I guess what I'm trying to say is, yes, cross-pollination, and it matters what we're cross-pollinating with. For me, that's coming from a lot of feminist philosophy, queer theory, ecological studies, and dance and performance studies as well are parts of the frameworks that I bring in terms of how I become more, what Kelly said, more holistic, more complete, more full in the astrology that I'm practicing.
Something I love about the term cross-pollination too, as you were describing all of those things, is cross-pollination references lineage in terms of there's an underlying past that has brought you to that moment, but it also speaks to generation or generative, the generative process of the spiritual practices that we do. And I think a lot of I want to word this carefully because I'm not meaning to offend anyone, but I think that a lot of practitioners I see kind of thinking about I'm just holding a mirror to my client. I think it reinforces that idea that it's like a neutral or like I'm just here to present one opinion. What my client does with that afterwards is not my responsibility. And rather, I think about the client and the practitioner coming together as being generating something together, and you're both responsible for a part in that process. Not to say that we're responsible for what happens in our clients' lives, but to think about the responsibility that we bring to that experience and understanding that we have influence and we have power in that situation. And if we're not being intentional with what we're bringing to the table in that moment, we may be unintentionally reinforcing patterns of harm for the individual, for the society, for ourselves. And I think about that a lot. I'm not sure if y'all have had this experience, but for myself, when clients come to me and they're asking about children, it really, I have this awareness of my own experience of a queer person and children and expectations on me and possibilities or doors that I feel like I've had to close for my own identity. And I do think that that heal the healer kind of mentality too requires some of that cross-pollination as well, requires some of those, what are the ways that you heal yourself? What are the ways that you pursue new information and new perspectives and integrate that into your practice, is a process of healing you for that, so that you have that ability to continue doing that for others. And it's all connected.
Yeah, Michael, when you talk about connection, do you want to just talk about co for you and all that signifies?
I do, but first I want to respond to something that Daniel said, which is about the just holding a mirror up to our clients, and I think that that's one of the maybe fundamental distinctions between a kind of assumption of objective knowledge that we see operating in a lot of the sciences and a lot of the STEM fields. And I'm coming at this really from the arts and humanities, but also from what gets called area studies. So rather than just science studies, the understanding of all knowledge as socially and culturally constituted and created, such that there is no just hold a mirror up to anything. How we hold up that mirror, the conditions in place surrounding that process is shaping the knowledge that we're producing. And so for me, rather than thinking of astrology as some sort of an objective knowledge production system, which I really don't believe in at all, it's much more of a way of telling a story together, of weaving together the client's experiences my experiences, the chart itself, the planets that the chart refers to, it becomes this fairly complex composition of moving dynamic parts through which something emerges called meaning. And that's really been part of my life through all of these creative practices that my life is full of, is how do we bring all of these different elements together and create them in a way, compose them in such a way that they become meaningful. Something that we could talk more about if we wanted to in terms of this storytelling is the quote from Donna Haraway, who I think she is actually referencing Marilyn Strathern, that it matters what stories we use to tell stories with. And if we think of sitting down and reading a chart as a way of telling a story about a person's life, regardless how we think astrology works, whether we think that this is some sort of omen or sign-based phenomenon, or whether we think that there's energetic causation at play, whatever we think of as the underlying metaphysics of astrology, in that moment, we're telling them a story about what we see in the chart. And it matters. I mean, this is where the question of what are we cross-pollinating with? It matters what we're bringing into the room. It matters who we're allowing to be part of the story. It matters what kinds of language and what kinds of assumptions we're making as we tell the story. And for me, to get to Drew's question, that has everything to do with connection. So yeah, my practice is called Co, which stands for a lot of different things. I just realized that as I started listing the things in my life that felt important to me, like connection and collaboration and cooperation and conjuring and combining and co-creating and corporeality and continuity and contradictions and co-presence and companionship, there was just, and the list is much longer. It all comes back to this prefix of co, which the etymology of co is with, to be together, to be in mutual exchange. And that's really what I think is operating in this practice for me, whether I'm reading astrology for someone or reading tarot or facilitating ritual, we are coming together, we are with. And it's that experience that we are in this together that I think is part of what's going to allow us to survive or even flourish, that none of us are actually in this alone. And that's what these practices, especially astrology, even engaging in the practice before any delineation has been made, already some kind of healing has started to happen because I'm not in this experience alone anymore. As I sit down with a chart, I am already bringing into my consciousness that I am in relation to the entire sky, that I have a place in this world, I have a place in this cosmos, and I'm not alone. And then I bring to that consciousness this long tradition of astrologers and librarians and translators and teachers and students and teachers and students. And so then when I sit down and I practice astrology, I'm practicing with this entire lineage of ancestors and allies and colleagues. And I'm practicing with a consciousness of this vast more than human world that I'm a part of. I am not alone in this. And then I, as an astrologer, as a practicing, consulting astrologer, I then get to offer that to a person, another person. They're in the room with me, but in the room with me in this practice of astrology, they are also in connection, in collaboration, in cooperation with this ancient lineage of all of these other people. And they're with the cosmos, the sky, the earth, and it's that experience of not being alone that I think starts to heal so much that wounds us in this world. So many of the wounds that we carry are disconnection period, but also a disconnection from the idea of relationality, that we are always in relation. There was no moment that you were alone. There was no moment that you had to do this on your own. And if we can start to live into that truth or reality, I think a lot of what we suffer from would begin to be in a process of healing.
We spoke a little bit as we were kind of planning what we might talk about during this episode about, and I actually, one of my colleagues is like so excited to hear this podcast for this reason. They have their own theories. Why queer people tend to gravitate anecdotally to astrology and to this type of spiritual practice. And I think the other thing before we get into that I kind of was thinking about too, as you were talking about connection, is when I initially got into the field and really started more seriously thinking about practicing, I think I had this stereotype or conception of the practice of astrology is sitting down with clients and working with them in sessions. And my experience in the community has been very different. And I'm only just now starting to understand, if we limit ourselves to the healing only happens there, we're really ignoring all of the connecting that we're doing outside of that kind of space. But any time that we're connecting and collaborating as colleagues, as professionals, as people who are studying and practicing, not, take the word professional out of it, we are doing that for each other. And that kind of community is its own type of healing and its own type of coming together for a purpose and creating meaning. And I didn't understand how powerful that would be for me, or how much, or how counting that as part of my practice and building my abilities and capacities to participate in that community is an essential part. You can't take that out of, in my opinion, that practice. And so, what are your perceptions of why so many queer people see astrology and really find a home in it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's several things, or it's a lot of things. I think the two that feel the most available to me right now is that astrology is a framework or a lens for introducing us to our own complexity. So contrary to the pervasive sun sign astrology that would sort all of human population into one of 12 archetypes, in fact, when we look at our chart, we see that there are as many possibilities for personhood as there are stars in the sky, as many possibilities for who you could become as there are relationships and aspects and placements and things. So that it's actually the complexity of the chart that gives us a sense of how much more we might already be and how much more we are becoming as life unfolds. And I think that permission for complexity is something that we as queer people crave, desire, long for in a world that is constantly trying to fit us into available categories that are highly reductionist, that require us to excise parts of ourselves that are integral to who we know ourselves to be, whether that's in terms of our sexualities or our genders or our sense of community, of what it means to be in community with others. We live our whole lives resisting that kind of reductionist categorization. And I think astrology gives us a tool or a framework for saying, oh, no, I'm actually more than that. And I can be more than that. And there's ways for giving an account of myself in all of that complexity. So I think that's a big part of it. And then I think that queer folk often feel alienated from our context, from where we are. And so belonging is something that most of us don't experience very much of in our day-to-day worlds organized by heteropatriarchy. And so then what can give us an experience of belonging? And by belonging, I mean something like that unshakable sense that I can be here, that I am of this place, that every part of me has ties to where I am that are not only meaningful, but they are part of who I am. And astrology gives us a framework for thinking about that, for recognizing it, for even for sharing it with other people. Like, I mean, this speaks a little bit to what you were saying about that the practice of astrology and how it connects us is so much more than just being in the consulting room. I feel such joy when I'm speaking with other astrologers or just people who speak astrology. What a weird way of saying exactly what I mean, that speak astrology, when someone can say, like, oh, well, my experience of relationships is like this because the ruler of my 7th house is in this other house. And it's like just being able to hear someone say those things and know what they're talking about and being able to respond in that same kind of language, that is part of the experience of belonging, that there is something that we can share that gives us a way of understanding our complexity, of making that legible to ourselves and other people when we as queer folk often feel illegible within the existing categories. Astrology gives us so many more layers and perspectives, such that identity doesn't have to be one thing or two things, but that identity is constellatory. It's this whole 3-4 dimensional map of possibilities in relation to one another, and that is you. Like, how awesome is that, to be able to recognize ourselves in such vastness of possibility.
Saying that, like, speaking astrology, I had such a true experience of that going to my first astrology conference. I remember leaving and just feeling like I was physically buzzing, and that people had been living in my head for like 4 days. And there was this beautiful experience too of like recognizing the complexity within each other's placements, even though there's an instantaneous recognition of archetypes or patterns or frameworks. We still were able to take that in, along with the idea that we're adding to our own understanding of that by listening to someone's experience of that too. And in that way, kind of, there's a lot of cross-pollinating going on, even just within your own field. But even to see how like different colleagues were bringing in different pieces or different understandings. And it's addicting. It's that kind of connection is not one that I found anywhere else. And I think that's one of the experiences in astrology that, unless you're really studying it, unless you're really speaking that level, it's hard to explain too. Telepathy is like the closest thing that I'm kind of like, it's just this very quick understanding between each other of kind of transcending some of the boundaries of, English was, kind of what we were speaking mostly. It's beautiful.
So Daniel, you mentioned this, like at the end of the weekend, feeling this almost physical buzzing of the sensation of belonging or connection. And so that's what you just said, that comment, that's the sort of thing I listen for in my consultation, because that moment you articulated that belonging was a physical sensation. So then if we can start to recognize like, oh, this is what belonging feels like, then that feeling state becomes a guide for us. It becomes a compass for, now I know what belonging feels like. Can I feel into this space when I enter a new context, when I'm trying to make a decision about a job, when I'm in a new relationship? Can I feel for this experience that now I know what it feels like? And if it's not there, then that's information for me. That's part of what I try to use this practice to refine, is that sensitivity or that awareness to those exact kinds of states, so that we have ways of using them and following them as we navigate our lives.
That's so beautiful. That's I've been thinking a lot about that recently. How sometimes things just come into your life and you're like, now I'm noticing them all of a sudden. And that idea that so many times when people come to you asking for help because they know you're an astrologer and they want they want something, I think it's because they either believe or aren't aware of, or can't access that feeling, and aren't aware that they may already be feeling the answer deep down, but how do they access that? And how do they, how do we use stories and frameworks to get them to reconnect to that feeling and understand that? And then that's a tool they can use beyond that session too. That's beautiful.
Exactly. So Drew, you were bringing us towards the pre-capitalist conditions of astrology and the ways in which capitalism depends upon these easy categorizations of people and lives that make things marketable, that fuel commodity culture. And where were you going with that?
Where I was going with, thank you for recapping. Where I was going with that is so you were talking about the, like that sensation of belonging that astrology brings and that Daniel experienced at the conference. One of the things that troubles me when I talk to people who are not astrologers about astrology is their expectation that astrology will put them into an easy category. And so with the popularization of astrology, I fear that there is this kind of like commodified logic or market logic seeping into astrology in the way that people understand it. So I'm wondering, like, just what you think about that phenomenon in general, and also how you navigate it with people to maybe open them up to the permission for complexity that astrology could give them, and ultimately that felt sense of belonging that we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, capitalism gets its hands on whatever it can and tries to reduce and simplify and sell back to us what we already had in the first place. And in terms of astrology, I think that reductionist simplification version of astrology that's become quite popular. Now there are apps for it. And I mean, or maybe it's not so new. I mean, that's sort of the basis of horoscopes, like newspaper horoscopes. It's like maybe this has been around for a while. But I do think that it's an instrument of capitalism. And I think that when I feel like people are approaching me or approaching a consult with that frame of like, just tell me which box to be in, then part of the groundwork I have to do at the front end is maybe helping them turn toward the fear of being more. What is threatening or what is unsettling about complexity? What is threatening or unsettling or potentially even disturbing? What disturbs us about the possibility that we don't fit in an easy category? And underneath that, of course, is something like a fear that we won't survive, that if we don't fit, I mean, if I play this out, if I bring my knowledge of feminist philosophy and queer theory to this, underneath the fear of category, the fear of not fitting in a category is then people won't be able to understand me. And if people aren't able to understand me, then perhaps on some instinctual level, my needs cannot be met. So if my gender is illegible to someone, can they see me as a person? Can they see me as a human? Can they see me as worthy of dignity, respect, and belonging? And if the answer to any of those questions are no, then maybe I can't get a job. Maybe I'm refused housing. I mean, this is the experience of trans folk, trans women of color, especially in this country, which is why we see such immense numbers in alternative economies, in illegal economies, and ending up in the prison industrial complex, is because illegibility, not fitting within an existing category, can be a matter of life and death. It can be a matter of survival. So of course, we feel some instinctual fear around our own complexity, because our own complexity would threaten the very validity of the categories that are used to distribute livability. And so if we begin to question the categories that are used to make livability available to some and unavailable to others, or more available to some and less available to others, then our entire kind of social system begins to come apart. And that's terrifying. I would say that's also the necessary conditions of anything like a liberatory revolution is, we actually have to undo and dismantle all of these existing categories. So how do I do that in a session? It's going to depend a little bit on the person and what they're bringing to the table. But I am going to invite them into, I'm going to give them an invitation to see themselves as more than they thought they were. That there are parts of themselves that maybe they've never acknowledged before. That there are parts of themselves that their social conditions, whether that's their family, their culture of origin, their education, have actually specifically encouraged them to not acknowledge. And if we can start from there, then something like just interpreting their rising sign of, like, for example, I work with Demetra George's life purpose framework that she develops in astrology and the authentic self, of looking at the rising sign, the ascendant, the ruler of the ascendant, the sun and moon. And she talks about the ascendant not only as the helm of life, but also as describing some basic needs that need to be in place in order for this person's life to flourish or thrive. And so if I look at someone and they have a water sign on the ascendant, and I say that it's possible that emotional connection, emotional security, feeling like you're feeling that your feelings are respected and understood is a basic condition of what you need in order to feel well in this world, already we're probably going to start moving into some territory that that our capitalist culture has not encouraged them to consider. And we haven't even talked about what sign it is. We've just talked about the elemental triplicity of the sign. And already I'm asking them to see a part of themselves that maybe they haven't considered, and perhaps they've been encouraged to not consider. So I don't think you're wrong. I think that this reductionist, simplified, popularized astrology operates as an instrument of capitalism, and then and I don't think it's too big of a claim to say an instrument of oppression. And so that in and of itself is even more of an indication that astrology is not neutral. How we use it and for what purposes and towards what forms of becoming makes a difference. And if I'm witnessing astrology that's primarily focused on simplification, reduction, and categorization, that's not an astrology that I think is oriented towards healing or liberation.
We've spoken. Go ahead.
No, I'm just going to problematize what I just said, unless it is. I think about something that Chani Nicholas has said a lot over the years, which is read for your rising sign or whatever. Read whatever feels like it's speaking truth and making it more possible to live another day. If sun sign astrology, if sorting yourself into one of 12 categories, if that gives you a sense that I'm not alone in the world and that there are other people like me and I can continue because of that, then maybe that is a tool of healing and liberation. So I'm just checking my own biases. I am biased towards complexity. I think that more healing is possible, the more we can feel, the more we can recognize, the more we can acknowledge. But if just identifying with one of these 12 signs, if already that makes getting up in the morning more possible, if that makes loving some part of yourself that feels recognized by what you know about that sign, if that is facilitating that work in some way, then maybe it can simultaneously be an instrument of liberation and also an instrument of capitalist oppression.
Well, and to that point, I find a lot of astrologers talking about that fourth dimension, and maybe there's even more we could talk about, of that, the birth chart's great and everything, but we don't experience our birth chart all at once. And we sometimes aren't even experiencing things that really relate back to our birth chart. Sometimes we're experiencing them because a person came into our lives and that person's energies are influencing us. Or sometimes we're experiencing a transformation of something that was in the birth chart into something new. And so, techniques that add complexity to that are very attractive to me, to a fault maybe. Transits or Time Lords or any of those pieces that help us add different lenses to that complexity, I think are a way that we give ourselves permission in that sense. I can't remember where I initially heard this, but something that rings true and kind of pops into my subconscious or pops out of my subconscious. The body knows what it needs. The body knows what you need. And if you're connected to those feelings that you're getting from your body, I think that's not any different than running into a horoscope and saying, "It me," like that is something I need right now. That is a healing, that is a medicine that my body is craving, that I'm craving. And it heals me regardless of whether it was meant for me or whether it was a capitalist tool or not. Like that is satisfying something in me. And hopefully it is, and it's not like further perpetuating harm. But I think it all comes back to that awareness, and that like what is increasing our awareness of ourselves and what our needs are, or how we're intersecting with systems that aren't recognizing our needs, or people who aren't recognizing our needs.
Yeah, I think that it's important what you're pointing to, the unfolding of the chart over time. The idea of the person not as a being, but as a becoming that is described by the chart, but that the chart itself is not static, that the chart is activated through different systems like perfections or zodiacal releasing, or folks who pay a lot of attention to secondary progressions, or put a lot of weight on the solar revolution or solar return chart. The timing techniques I use most are annual perfections, which then bring transits into focus in a different way. So I don't assume that everyone's going to experience a Mars transit in the same way, or Saturn transit. It's going to relate depend a lot on sect, but it's also going to depend on what's being activated that year by perfection. And I think even just applying those techniques is already conceiving of personhood and subjectivity in different terms. The idea that you are not a static, unchanging automaton, that you are a process. In fact, you are countless processes. You are countless processes and cycles of change unfolding at different rates and in relation to one another. That's what I think astrology gives us the tools and the resources to become aware of, like you're saying, to become conscious to. And that is actually I also integral to my understanding of healing, that healing is not a static situation. It's not an event. It's not. So Anna Halpern is one of my great teachers on healing. She's a postmodern dance pioneer who has used dance as ritual and as a healing practice since the 1960s. And it was one of the first I heard describe healing in this way, of that it is a nonlinear process. It's not about getting to an end point of, okay, now I am healed, but that healing itself is in the process, not a process leading to something. It's being in the process is the healing. Understanding yourself in a process of change, that is already healing. And I'm convinced of that. The more I do my own work of healing in different parts of my life, but also as I support other people in their processes of healing, that it's not leading to something. It is the healing already, is being in this process of relation, of connection, and coming into more connection to more of ourselves. And the ending or the outcome might not look like what we think it is. One of the other great teachers on healing in my life is Dory Midnight, who's a Jewish witch and intuitive healer in Massachusetts. And she talks about being in healing processes with people who are dying, that then recovery isn't the purpose of that healing. Life isn't even the purpose of that healing. It is being in the process and in a connection of care. That's the healing. Or if we apply a disability justice framework, the idea that there are chronic situations that aren't going away, that the alleviation of symptoms or even the alleviation of suffering may not be the purpose of healing, because if it were, then we're saying from the start that some people cannot experience healing. Well, that can't be true. So then how do we allow our understanding of healing to shift and grow and expand by centering the experiences of those who are most marginalized? How does our conception of healing grow and develop because we're understanding healing from something like a perspective of disability, or from a perspective like a mobile experience of gender, or a perspective like the centuries of ancestral trauma that people of color in the United States live with, not only embodied, but also daily in the very systems that continue to persist because of hundreds of years of enslavement and enforced labor. Like, what does healing mean in those contexts is what healing should mean for all of, or could mean for all of us, I think. And all of that has to do with that process of time, of allowing it to unfold, of being in the cycle, being in the process rather than the end point. Yeah.
I think one of the important mentors that I've never met in person in my life has been Adrienne Marie Brown. And, speaking to a lot of the ideas of nonlinearity and transforming community and transforming, really talks about the process of becoming versus restoring. And you can't restore something that never was. Just a lot resonates, I think, about her principles of emergent strategy that has really become a core focus of just like everything I do, including astrology, but also, working within relationships, working within communities, working outside of astrology. And that idea that although we tend to believe that we experience time linearly, when we understand iteration and when we understand nonlinearity and recognize it, I think that becomes a healing process too. I mean, there's so much that capitalism really depends on the idea of linear time. And when you start to break that down, and it allows you to kind of like peek outside of the system, that's an initiatory experience. That is magic. And I think that being able to provide that to other people is a huge gift to their understanding of themselves and the context that they're living in.
Mm-hmm. That makes me think about a little bit of what we've been talking about with storytelling, because stories can be open-ended, but also stories can make things that didn't seem open-ended more open-ended. Like, I'm thinking about this idea of nonlinear time. We often think about the past as something that's just fixed, like it already happened. And we think about the future as something that has not happened yet and that is emerging now. And so it's easy to think about the future as something that's more open and the past is something that cannot change. And now we're in the present, ready to transform the fixed past into the flexible future. I think that one of the things that storytelling does, and especially as an astrologer working with somebody else, stories narrate where we come from in a way that actually produces different conditions. When we tell a story, we are creating new conditions for the future by reorienting ourselves to where we've come from. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one of the things that's so powerful about storytelling, is that we're re-narrativizing our present, our past, in order to create a different future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And I think that's completely in line with Adrienne Maree Brown's work. And I just want to highlight for us, and then also for listeners, that this was a really important moment in the conversation of cross-pollination, of being able to bring the work of Adrienne Maree Brown into this discussion of healing nonlinear time, healing as a process and a cycle, and nonlinear time that Drew's bringing in, of being able to not only think forward, but also think backwards, to change our relationships to the futures that have not yet become, but also to change our relationships to what we might be conditioned to think of as a fixed past that's in fact also still in process, that we are still in active and dynamic relationships to our pasts as well. And I think of Adrienne's work, I mean, especially in emergent strategy. I mean, as soon as you said Adrienne Maree Brown, I thought, like, this is one of my greatest teachers on time. She says at one point in that book that we're living in times of such urgent crisis that it can often feel like the only response is more urgency. But in fact, it's urgency thinking, this constant, relentless, unsustainable growth and pursuit that actually brought us into these crises in the first place, that actually the solutions for all of these urgent problems are probably going to be in the slowness, in the slowing down. And when people ask me, like, what does astrology bring to your life? Nothing in the sky happens as fast as the relentless acceleration that we are conditioned to expect of ourselves and one another in a capitalist world. I mean, the moon, it's the fastest moving body in the sky, and it takes 28, 29 days to make a full cycle. Imagine if we gave ourselves that kind of time on anything, any sort of deadline, let alone, Saturn and Pluto and so on. So I think astrology is one of those tools that Adrienne is pointing us towards in terms of how do we practice slowness? How do we live into a different mode of temporality? And astrology is predicated on not only a slower temporality, but many slower temporalities. What does it mean to live in consciousness of that every day? To track, where's the moon now? Where is Mercury now? Where is Venus and Saturn and so on? To track those and to live our lives with an awareness of this much slower temporality, I think has profound possibilities for us. And when you were speaking about Adrienne's work, it also reminded me of Angela Davis's work. And Angela Davis is probably my other greatest teacher on time. Although the thing about nonlinearity and healing our own past makes me think of Alexis Pauline Gumbs as well. But I don't think we have time for me to go through the work of 3 Black feminists. But who knows? Maybe we do. But
Adrienne Maree Brown would say there's always time for the right work.
I agree. And I am definitely going to talk us through some Angela Davis, because it's not something that's circulated very much. It's not something she wrote. She gave a talk with Judith Butler years ago that I watched on YouTube, and it's actually in the Q&A. Someone comes up to the microphone, someone who seems like a student, and they're just kind of like in knots about the state of the world. And they ask a question, something along the lines of, like, how do I get people to understand, like, my friends and my friends' parents? It's like everything's so wrong, and like they just don't get it, and how do we fix it? And Angela Davis takes a deep breath and sighs, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't have it memorized, but she says something along the lines of, it sounds like you're operating in the temporality of capitalism. You want an answer right now for problems that have been hundreds of years in the making. And it's possible that the solutions are also going to be hundreds of years in the making. So then how does doing the justice work require us to operate in these multiple temporalities, in a passionate urgency within the present, while letting go of seeing the outcome of this work? That what if abolitionists and folks working to emancipate enslaved people, what if they gave up because they didn't see an outcome in 40 years? This is 400, 500 years of enslavement, and people working to see the end of that knowing that they were not going to see the end of that. What if we gave ourselves not only that kind of temporality in our social justice work, but in our lives, in our transits, in our own processes of a becoming? What if we recognize that none of us are going to see a full Pluto cycle? So then what does Pluto do in our charts? How do we relate to this part of a story that we're a part of, knowing we're not going to see the outcome of it? But that's true of actually everything. Like even no matter how many cycles of Saturn we see in our lifetime, we don't see the end of it. As Chani Nicholas says all the time, the planets just keep going. Like there's not a moment at which it's going to stop. And so thinking with Angela Davis on that, which is again another moment of cross-pollination, being able to think that astrology could teach us something about how to do the justice work, and the justice work, pursuing social justice, pursuing justice for Black and brown lives, for justice for queer and trans folk, justice for disabled folk, justice for all kinds of marginalized positionalities. How do we bring that into how we practice our astrology? What if that's part of why we are becoming more conscious of these vast expanses of time, is to be able to imagine justice in a future that we won't see?
It's literal time travel.
It is.
Astrologers make jokes all the time about like, I don't really know what day it is or what year it is, because I'm looking at charts that are like way not right now. And the ideas from even Adrienne Marie Brown cites Octavia Butler, Black science fiction writer. And when you read Octavia Butler, it's emergent strategy applied in this wonderful sci-fi context where there's literal time travel, or she writes stories that take place over hundreds of years. And there's so much in there that is healing. And when we see where that comes up in our society, I'll say like Black Panther and Afrofuturism, and when people don't understand why that's important, I'm like, I just want to shake them and be like, are you kidding me? Like this is dreaming on a whole new level. This is allowing us to step outside of the times that we're in, to understand and hold on to this idea that time doesn't matter the way we think it does. Interdimensionality is kind of what it reminds me of. And, holding on to an alternate version of what we're experiencing isn't just escapism. It's an important ingredient in understanding that is a possibility for us too in time, and through the right processes, or not the right, but through processes that are more about connecting and more about community than capitalism, for example.
Exactly. I mean, it's what Jose Esteban Munoz called utopia. Queer utopia is the possibility that we could experience in the present what it could be like under different conditions. Or it's what, I mean, a lot of scholars, but I think of Alexis Pauline Gumbs talking about fugitivity. The idea of, fugitivity has been thought in a lot of different ways, but the way that she talks about it is a commitment, a belief so fervent in a possibility for what it could be like, even when all of the existing conditions tell you otherwise. And she gives the example of Harriet Tubman saying, my people are free, under the conditions of slavery when her people were not free, but living into that reality that freedom is not only possible, freedom is the reality that I am choosing to live into for my people. And so then when we do astrology, how can we look at the significations of the chart as ways of bringing us into other possible futures, but also other possible presents and pasts? What if the significations of the chart introduce us to another way of thinking that's perhaps not only out of alignment with the existing prevailing condition, but potentially an act of resistance to those existing conditions? Can we look at the marker of harm a marker of harm in our charts, and also see possibilities for healing or harm, and that being a position from which to critique. It's getting a little abstract, but the idea of the chart or the significations of the chart bringing us into a consciousness of the kinds of other possibilities, those utopic, those fugitive possibilities for what it could be like to live differently than how we've been taught to live so far.
I love that our conversation is veering in the direction of maybe a more like Neptunian kind of conversation, because, well, the moon is applying to Neptune as we're talking, so that's pretty cool. But I think Neptune is a great way to think about what astrologers do. Like Neptune has this archetype as like a spiritual wanderer, but this idea about dreaming in order to be otherwise, like dreaming from the present is not like, it's not pointless. Like there absolutely is utility, I hate using that word, but there is productivity, or there is potentiality in dreaming, and that is exactly what I think we're doing right now, and what I hope that astrology can continue to do as a form of resistance, using time and using resistant temporalities in opposition, or not aversion, but in opposition to contemporary capitalism and historical systems of oppression.
Agreed. Yeah, it's something that I talk about a lot in my teaching, that fantasy is our teacher and our guide. Fantasy is not wasted. Fantasy gives us the experience of feeling what could be. And then those feelings, like Daniel's feeling of belonging after the conference, that those feelings that fantasy introduces us to not only function as a critique of the present, which that's something that Judith Butler writes about. I think it's in Undoing Gender, where she writes about fantasy as critique of existing conditions. But so not only is fantasy a critique of existing conditions, it gives us access to those felt guides of here is what could be, and I know what it feels like in my body, which is essentially anti-capitalist, to say I have right here in my body all that I need in order to be well, in order to experience abundance, in order to know love and connection and belonging. It's actually all here within my system, within this body. And I think, that the astrology, for me, is a tool to bring us into that. Not that astrology itself is a fantasy, but the story that we tell with astrology, like fantasy, can be a critique of existing conditions and can bring us back to the knowledge, the wisdom, the intuition, and potentiality that's already there within our bodies. And that's what's anti-capitalist about it, or part of, or a thing that's anti-capitalist about it, that it is guiding us back to our own resources. We don't have to accrue or aggregate or buy anything else if our chart leads us to a part of ourselves that's the key to our own healing and belonging. That's anti-capitalist, I think, and potentially decolonial as well.
Wow. I'm getting chills. We mentioned, we're coming up on, speaking of time, we're about maybe 15 minutes over an hour once everything is said and done. Was there anything else that we had talked about? I'm just looking at our outline that we wanted to make sure that we captured. I think we've the journey has been well worth wherever we have ended up now. But what else would we want to say?
I think that thing about citationality is important, because that's something that we've been performing, or that certainly Michael and I think both of you have been performing, saying where ideas come from, and why that's important. First of all, as traditional astrologers, citing sources, but also as we cross-pollinate. So Michael, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so citationality. So Sarah Ahmed, who's a queer feminist of color, amazing scholar and public intellectual, talks about citationality as a feminist practice, that saying whose ideas we're working with, who we are in collaboration with intellectually, culturally, socially, is a resistance to a mode of knowledge production that would center something like the heroic genius individual who I am solely responsible for all of these ideas. That's not true. That's not real. That we are all always in conversation with our teachers, our ancestors, all that we've read, all that we've encountered. And so the more we can make that network of connections, of cross-references, the more we can make that tangible and present and legible for the people that we're talking to, that's a cultural shift towards collaboration, towards codependence, towards shared power, shared responsibility. All of these are feminist values. This is part of what we're working towards. And so, yeah, being able to name where we read this in terms of the astrological scholarship, but also who we're directing people towards, so that if we talk about something like an emergent strategy, we can point someone to, and this comes from the work of Adrienne Marie Brown, or if I give this working definition of love, I can point them towards Bell Hook's work. Or if I'm talking about the fifth house and we start speculating about what the erotic might mean, I can direct them towards Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic. The erotic is power, but also Adrienne Marie Brown's pleasure activism, so that it keeps coming back to connection. This is why the practice is called Co for me, that the more I can bring people into connection with more resources, the less any of us have to feel alone in these processes of healing and liberation. And I guess that's the other theme, and when I'm just skimming over the outline that we put together, that feels worth acknowledging, that embedded in all of this, and I think it's been all through the conversation, but just to make it explicit, that part of my bias comes from the healing justice framework, which was developed by Kara Page and other folks, that understands that our personal healing is not separate from collective liberation. We cannot heal on our own what is probably symptomatic of larger systemic issues. Similarly, we can't liberate ourselves if we're not dealing with our own personal healing, that the two are inseparable, the personal healing and the collective liberation, the social justice work, the activism and the organizing. And so bringing that consciousness into how we practice astrology, what is it that you're working on in your own life, is part of what we're doing, but then also contextualizing that within larger systems of harm, within larger movements and struggles, and recognizing that what you're working on in your own life is only your part of something that's larger than you, part of a larger process, a larger cycle, a larger movement. And that's also what I feel like we have the opportunity, or even the responsibility, to introduce people to, that not only are you not in this process of healing alone, not only are there all of these citations and references, this whole constellation of others with whom we're doing this work, but also the work that you are doing on yourself, with yourself, is part of something bigger than you, that you are doing this healing backwards for your ancestors. You are healing forwards to whatever life continues on this planet. You're healing sideways to those with whom you're in solidarity and coalition. And if we can understand the work that we're doing in our healing processes, but also in our astrology as part of that, how does that open up this practice so that it's not just a thing we do for self-reflection or for a personal spiritual journey, and recognize that part of why we do it is to recognize our place in something larger.
I think that is what you just said is incredible, and it makes me think about why astrology has always been, or since I discovered astrology, why it has really gotten me to the core. It does feel like it's part of something larger. You identify the patterns, you see the signs, and it happens. And it alludes to the bigness of the universe and like the how things come together in this special way. And so that's why I'm so happy that we've had this conversation and have been able to get your thoughts and hear your background and hear the citations, because I think this kind of conversation is exactly the kind of conversation that I want to continue to have on this podcast. And I'm just so grateful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't think we could end on a better note. So I want to just echo Drew's gratitude. I think that, even this conversation for me, I'll say personally, is a part of my healing journey. And I recognize how I'm going to now carry that into the communities that I work in to everyday pursue what degree of liberation can we get to today, and understanding that bigger picture over time. And that feeling of just being in it together is so important. So thank you for being with us as we record this tonight.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I think that this is part of it. This is doing the work, being in meaningful co-created experiences like this conversation, which then also lives in another form as a podcast, but already we've done the meaningful work here as well. And then it continues to proliferate in all of its forms. So where can people find out more about you?
That's right. That's a part of this too. I'm just like, yes, good, story done.
Yeah, there is a script here, actually.
Great.
Michael, can you tell us more about you and where to, or we know about you now, but where to find you, yada, yada.
Yeah, so online, people can find me at my website, which is michaeljmorris.co, on Instagram at Co Witchcraft Offerings, on Twitter at Morris Michael J, and on Facebook at Co Witchcraft Offerings. I offer consultation practices in person and across distance in person in Columbus, Ohio. I do consults at Witch Lab. And then through Zoom. So if people are interested in looking for more support in making meaning of their lives, or connection in their own processes of healing, if any of this conversation feels like, yeah, that's the kind of practice I want to be in, they can find me on any of those places and the bookings page on my website.
Wonderful. And for our viewers and listeners who have been with us and kind of understand the episodes we've done before, I also want to acknowledge that we are not doing a forecast this episode, but we do hope to record one together still for the month of, here's that time travel thing. Where are we? November already? So look for that later on. At the end of October, even though this episode will be released closer to the middle of October. So definitely still want to think about this conversation and apply that to our what's going on astrologically for November. All right. Well, thank you for listening and watching, and we will catch you hopefully on that next episode. Bye.
Thank you.